My fiancé left me for my best friend. A year later, they invited me to their wedding. I went, smiling, holding a secret of my own. As they said their vows, the priest looked at me and said, "Would you like to say something?" I nodded and handed the groom an envelope. "Before you say I do, read this." His face turned pale as he opened it. The entire wedding came to a screeching halt. I should have known. I look back now and see all the signs like flashing neon lights, but at the time, I was blind. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. Milo and I had been together for 5 years. We met at a friend's housewarming party in Chicago. He was charming in a way that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When he spoke, he really looked at you, like you were something special. And for years, I believed I was. We had built a life together, an apartment in the West Loop, lazy Sunday mornings at our favorite coffee shop, plans for a future with a house, a dog, maybe a kid or two. We were engaged. The wedding was supposed to be in the fall. Everything felt solid. And Leona? She was my best friend of over a decade. We met in college and became inseparable. We lived together for a while, shared heartbreaks, celebrated every success. She was the sister I never had. So when I walked into my own apartment and found my fiancé in bed with my best friend, something inside me broke. I remember it in pieces. The way their heads snapped toward me. The look on Milo's face, shock, then panic, then guilt. Leona, clutching the sheets to her chest like that would somehow fix things. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, staring at the two people I loved most, realizing in real time that I had lost them both. Milo started stammering some excuse. I don't even remember what it was because all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Leona had tears in her eyes, as if she was the one who had just been betrayed. I left without a word. I packed my things that night and never went back. I didn't fight for anything, not the apartment, not the furniture, not even the savings account we had been building for our wedding. I wanted out. Completely. That was the last time I saw them. Until a year later. One day, an invitation arrived in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting instantly. Milo and Leona cordially invite you to their wedding. I laughed when I saw it. A full, out-loud laugh, the kind that comes from deep in your chest. It was absurd. At first, I thought, there's no way in hell I'm going to this. But then, something shifted. A quiet, steady whisper in my head. Go. So I did. The wedding was grand. Leona always had a flair for the dramatic. It was at a country club in the suburbs, the kind of place that screamed old money, even though neither of them came from wealth. I arrived early and found a seat near the back, blending in with the crowd. Nobody expected me to be there. Milo's face drained of color the moment he saw me. Leona froze mid-laugh, her hand gripping her champagne flute a little too tightly. I smiled at both of them and waved. The ceremony began. Everything was picture perfect, white roses, gold accents, soft string music playing in the background. The priest smiled as he turned to Milo. Do you, Milo, take Leona? Then he paused. Looked at me. Would you like to say something? A hush fell over the room. The air felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. I stood up. Walked forward, heels clicking against the marble floor. Milo's hands were already shaking when I handed him the envelope. Before you say I do, read this. Silence. Milo swallowed hard, hesitated, then carefully opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the document inside. And then his face drained of all color. His lips parted, but no words came out. Leona frowned, impatient. What is that? Milo turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. You signed it. Leona snatched the paper from his hands and started reading. As her eyes moved down the page, her breathing became shallow. Her hands trembled. Then she screamed. The moment Leona screamed, the entire room froze. It wasn't the kind of soft, startled gasp you hear at weddings when something small goes wrong, like a flower girl tripping. No, this was something raw, almost inhuman. A noise dragged straight from the depths of her chest. People started whispering. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, unsure if this was part of the ceremony or if they were watching a disaster unfold in real time. Milo looked like he had stopped breathing. His fingers trembled as he reached for the document again, but Leona yanked it away. What is this? She hissed, her voice breaking. I tilted my head. You don't recognize it? I could see her mind racing, flipping through memories, trying to figure out where she had seen this before. And then it hit her. Her entire body went still. Milo's jaw clenched, and I saw his throat bob as he swallowed hard. Tell me this is a joke, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I smiled. It wasn't a joke. A year ago, when I left, I didn't just walk away. I let them think I had. I let them believe I was so broken, so defeated, that I didn't care about anything we built together. But I cared. Oh, I cared. Milo and I had a legal agreement, a prenup draft, signed and notarized before he ever cheated. It was something we had done early in our engagement, back when we were still playing house and pretending forever was guaranteed. I had pushed for it, not because I didn't trust him, but because I had watched too many people get destroyed in breakups. At the time, he laughed and said, "We'll never need this, but sure." And then he cheated. But here's the thing, the agreement didn't just protect me in case of divorce. It also included financial clauses tied to infidelity. And because the wedding hadn't happened yet, it wasn't a divorce issue. It was a liability issue. The moment he married Leona, she inherited half of everything, his debts, his financial obligations, and in this case, a legal clause that would make her responsible for a six-figure financial penalty. She had signed it. She just didn't know it. I had sent it to her months ago, disguised as a wedding planning document. And like the reckless, thoughtless person she had always been, she had signed it without reading. Now, she was on the hook for everything. "You tricked me," she whispered, voice shaking. I raised an eyebrow. "No. I just gave you exactly what you wanted." Milo turned to her, eyes wide with something between horror and rage. "You signed it?" She didn't answer. The guests were restless now, sensing that whatever was happening wasn't going to be solved with a few whispered apologies. Leona let out a breathless laugh, but it was the kind that came from disbelief, not humor. She turned back to me, eyes blazing. "You think this is over?" I shrugged. "I think you should finish the ceremony. After all, there's a lot of money on the line." She looked like she wanted to lunge at me. Milo ran a hand through his hair, his entire face twisted in frustration. He turned toward the priest. I need a minute," he stammered, then grabbed Leona's wrist and pulled her to the side. I watched them whisper fight, their voices too hushed for anyone else to hear. Milo's expression was tight, furious. Leona's hands kept flailing, gesturing toward me. I could guess exactly what she was saying. "Fix this. Do something." I almost felt bad for them. Almost. The guests were still staring, some pretending not to, but failing miserably. Leona's mother had a hand over her mouth, wide-eyed. The wedding planner was near tears. Even the priest looked like he wanted to disappear. After a few tense minutes, Milo turned back to me. His jaw was tight. His eyes held something unreadable. "You win," he muttered. I smiled, but before I could respond, someone else did. A voice from the crowd, sharp and familiar. "Not yet." I turned. And there, standing near the aisle, was someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone I never expected to show up. And suddenly, I wasn't so sure I was the one in control anymore. The moment that voice cut through the chaos, I felt the air shift. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my ears, and there he was, Dorian. Dorian wasn't a friend. He wasn't even an acquaintance. He was Milo's problem. A problem that, from the look of sheer panic on Milo's face, hadn't gone away. Dorian walked forward, smooth and confident, like he had every right to be here. His suit was crisp, expensive. He looked like someone who had walked out of a corporate empire, the kind of man who made people nervous without having to say a word. Milo stepped back, and for the first time that night, he wasn't just shocked, he was scared. Leona, still clutching the paper, frowned. "Who the hell?" Milo cut her off. "What are you doing here?" Dorian smirked. "Oh, don't stop on my account." I was enjoying the show. I could see it now, the way Milo's hands were shaking, the way he swallowed hard like he was trying not to be sick. This wasn't just an old friend. This was something worse. Leona looked between them, then turned to me. "Who is this?" I didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know. But judging by the way Milo looked like he'd rather set himself on fire than have this conversation, I knew one thing, Dorian had just changed the game. He pulled something out of his pocket and held it up. A small envelope. The second Milo saw it, all the color drained from his face. "No," he whispered. Dorian grinned. "Oh, yes." And then, right there, in front of everyone, he tossed the envelope at Milo's feet. Milo flinched like it was a bomb. I looked down and saw the words printed on the front. Legal notice of debt collection. I blinked. What? The whispers in the crowd got louder. The priest took a slow step back. Leona grabbed the envelope, ripped it open, and scanned the letter inside. Her hands trembled as she read it. Then she turned to Milo, eyes wide with something between horror and pure rage. What the hell is this? Milo opened his mouth, but no words came out. Leona shoved the paper into his chest. You owe him 6 figures? The crowd exploded. Dorian looked amused. Actually, closer to 7 now. Interest is a bitch. Leona was shaking. You never told me about this. I just signed a contract tying myself to you. Do you understand what you've done? Milo finally snapped. It's not my fault. Leona let out a breathless, bitter laugh. Oh, really? Then whose fault is it, Milo? Because it sure as hell looks like I did it for you. Silence. Leona's face twisted. What? Milo's hands were in his hair now, eyes darting between her, me, Dorian, and the growing crowd of horrified wedding guests. I took the loan for you, Leona. To pay for your life, your goddamn lifestyle, your car, your stupid designer. Leona slapped him. Hard. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Milo stumbled back, holding his cheek. You don't. Leona's voice was deadly. Do not stand there and act like this is my fault. She turned to Dorian. Is there a way to separate this? Dorian raised an eyebrow. You signed a legally binding agreement, sweetheart. Leona's face crumpled. Milo tried to reach for her, but she stepped back like he was diseased. I can fix this. Fix what? Leona snapped, eyes wild. You lost everything. We lost everything. She turned to me. And I saw it. The realization sinking in. The understanding that I hadn't just ruined her wedding, I had destroyed her future. Her lip trembled. You set me up. I smiled. No, Leona. You did that yourself. The room spun. Leona swayed on her feet. Milo looked like he was on the verge of passing out. Dorian adjusted his cufflinks, bored. Well. This has been fun, but I have another event to get to. He turned to Milo. I'll be in touch. Don't try to run. And just like that, he walked away. Leona turned to Milo, and I saw something snap behind her eyes. Then she did something none of us expected. She ripped off her wedding ring and threw it to the floor. And then, without another word, she grabbed her dress and ran. Leona's white dress billowed behind her as she ran. The sound of her heels clacking against the marble floor echoed through the stunned silence of the ballroom. Gasps and hushed whispers rippled through the crowd as she shoved past guests, past stunned relatives, past the flower arrangements she'd probably spent months picking out. No one moved to stop her. The wedding was over. Milo was still frozen in place, eyes darting between the crumpled legal notice at his feet and the exit Leona had just disappeared through. His hands twitched like he wanted to chase after her, like he thought maybe if he could just talk to her, he could fix this. But he didn't move. Because for the first time I think he realized there was nothing left to fix. I let out a slow breath, watching him. The weight of the room pressed in, thick with tension. Someone coughed. Someone else muttered, Jesus Christ. And then, finally, Milo turned to me. His expression was unreadable at first, just blank shock, like his brain hadn't fully caught up yet. But then something flickered. His lips pressed together. His hands curled into fists. You. His voice was raw, barely above a whisper. I tilted my head. Me? His jaw clenched. You planned this. I didn't deny it. Because of course I had. I didn't force him to cheat. I didn't make him lie to me, to Leona, to himself. I didn't take out that massive loan. I didn't trick Leona into signing a contract without reading it. All I did was let him bury himself. And now, standing here in front of me, he knew it. His shoulders shook, and for a second, I thought he was going to lose it right there in front of everyone. But then he laughed. Not a real laugh. A bitter, broken, exhausted kind of laugh, like the last piece of him had finally snapped. You really hated me that much? His voice was hoarse. Enough to, what? To ruin my life? I took a slow step toward him, just enough to make sure he could hear me when I said, no, Milo. You ruined your life. I just made sure you had a front row seat. His nostrils flared. His eyes burned. For a moment, I thought he might yell, might lash out, might finally break in front of all these people. But then his gaze flickered to the guests, to the dozens of people staring at him, waiting for a reaction. And Milo? Milo was too much of a coward to fall apart in public. So instead, he did what he always did. He ran. He stormed down the aisle, past the horrified expressions, the murmurs, the camera phones subtly recording the disaster. He grabbed the door handle so hard it rattled. And then, he was gone. The second the doors slammed shut behind him, the ballroom erupted. Did that just happen? Someone whispered. Holy shit. I told you something was off. Somewhere in the back, Leona's mother was crying. The wedding planner had her head in her hands. A couple of groomsmen just stood there, wide-eyed, like they were still processing the fact that they had literally just lost their best man and groom in under 3 minutes. And me? I felt light. Like I had been carrying this weight for so long that I forgot what it was like to stand up straight. I turned to leave. I had no reason to stay anymore. But as I took a step, a familiar voice stopped me. I don't know if I should be impressed or terrified. I turned. Dorian was still there, hands in his pockets, watching me with something between amusement and curiosity. I sighed. What do you want? He shrugged. Nothing. Just had to see how it ended. I raised an eyebrow. And? He smirked. Not bad. Then, just like that, he turned and walked away. I should have been relieved that he was gone. That whatever connection he had to Milo was no longer my problem. But something about him unsettled me. And the way he had watched all of this unfold, like he was taking notes, made me wonder if I had just unknowingly set something else in motion. By the time I walked outside, the sun was setting. The sky was painted in soft oranges and pinks, completely oblivious to the wreckage of the day. I didn't know where Leona had run off to. I didn't know if Milo would try to fix things or if he would let the weight of his own mistakes crush him. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. They had taken so much from me, my trust, my home, my sense of security. And now? They had nothing left to take. I slipped my sunglasses on, took one last look at the grand, extravagant wedding that would never be, and smiled. Then I walked away. And this time I wasn't the one running,